Three kings named Charles, but how are they all related?
So our first Charles is Charles I, funnily enough. There we go, 1625. We'll give him a date there. But we're going to mention his dad as well, because his dad was James VI of Scotland, James I of England, and he becomes quite important later on in the story. He did have an older brother, Charles. Henry Frederick was his name, but he died before his dad, so he never became king. But it was okay because he had a brother and the throne went to Charles. Now, Charles fought with the parliamentarians and, over power and religion, and he lost, and they chopped his head off. And for a while there was an interregnum with Oliver Cromwell and his son for a bit, but that went wrong and the monarchy was asked back. And it was okay because Charles I had a son and his name was Charles and he became our second Charles. I'll put the date in there as well. Now that went a bit wrong because he didn't have a legitimate heir. So the throne went to his brother and he was called James II of England. Now James did have children. One was called Mary, one was called Anne, and then he had later on with a different wife, a Catholic wife, he had a son called James. Now, James II, thrown out or ran away, whichever way you want to put it, was exiled to Europe with his Catholic son. And so, there we go. We'll put him over there. He had a son who was Bonnie Prince Charlie, tried to get the throne back, but it didn't work. Anyway, the throne went to Mary, and she ruled with her cousin, who was called William. She was married to William of Orange. William III. So they ruled together, but they didn't have an heir, and the throne went to her sister Anne. Anne, despite all her pregnancies, didn't have an heir. So where was it going to go? It wasn't going to go to the Catholics. That had already been decided. So the closest relative, who was a Protestant, goes all the way back to Charles I and his line.
James, sorry.
So he also had a daughter who was called Elizabeth, and she had a daughter who was Sophia. Now, Sophia died only a few months before Anne, so never made it to the throne. But she had a son, and he was called George. So he became the first George Hanover. Now, he had a son, and he was called George. He was George II, and he had a son, and he was called Frederick. Frederick wasn't allowed the throne because he wasn't called George. That's a joke, by the way. He died before his dad. But it was okay because he had a son, and he was called George, and he became George III. He had a son, and he was George IV. George IV died without a legitimate heir because his daughter Charlotte had died in childbirth, and so had the boy. And so the throne went to his brother, and he was called William, and he became William IV. He died without an heir, but it was okay because he had a brother called Edward. He was dead, but he had a daughter called Victoria. Victoria had a son called Bertie, who became Edward VII. He had a son who became George V. And he had oh, hang on, I've gone offline, sorry. Ed VIII, we're going to put there, abdicated in favour of his brother George VI. He had a daughter called Elizabeth II. And then we've got our third Charles in 2020.